it's a great medium of exchange and a great store of value. And I think a lot of the people that are holding on, and this is actually a bit of a debate that we have in the Bitcoin community, is I often sort of have this debate with people that are, fiercely hanging on to this store of value digital gold only narrative, because I'm like, well, I don't see it that way, and my experience is very different. I've literally been using it as a medium of exchange since 2014.
Blockmates Orange is sponsored by Core Network, the ultimate Bitcoin-powered EVM-compatible blockchain. Learn more about Core at blockmates.com.
Welcome back, everyone. Bit of a change, like looking at a feel-good, awesome story here. I got Herman, who's dialed in from up the coast. It's a South African affair today. Herman's behind Bitcoin Ekasi. I know that he's not the only one. I think there's a whole platoon of people involved there in the community up the coast, going to grassroots level. And in South Africa, when we talk about grassroots, we're talking about people in the townships. For those who don't know what a township is, the ghetto, people have nothing. They literally have nothing. Herman and his team have gone in with Bitcoin and essentially making lives better in the most fundamental way, teaching kids how to surf, skateboard, building infrastructure around that, involving community. You guys rock. Thanks for doing that, and welcome to Blockmates Orange. Herman, thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me. Very generous intro. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's all the truth. I mean, I've been watching what you guys have been doing for a while now, and give us an intro. Like, what was behind this? I mean, obviously Bitcoin's pretty much at the core of it, but so is making a difference. Tell us about your journey and what you guys have been up to.
Yeah, sure, man. Bitcoin's at the core of it. I guess there's two elements, or probably there's three primary elements. The one is obviously Bitcoin. I've been obsessed with it for almost longer than I can remember. I got into it first when I had some contact with people who went through the Cypriot banking crisis, is what you would call it, I guess, in 2013. Lost money because the banks gave customers a default haircut. People lost deposits because the banks were irresponsible and essentially confiscated funds. And I just became obsessed with Bitcoin since then, because that struck me as being completely unfair that a bank can just do that. And then we started. I mean, we have a business, my wife and I, a tourism business. And our clients are mostly Eastern European and Russian. She's from Russia, and so she does the marketing. She has always been the one doing the marketing for the business. It's a surf tourism business. And when the first Ukrainian conflict broke out, we in 2014, we had no way to receive payments from clients, and by that time I'd been into Bitcoin for a while, and so I suggested to people to pay us in Bitcoin. I'm happy to accept that as payment. And it worked really well. It was super easy, and it was just, I just never looked back from there onwards. I mean, once you've made your first Bitcoin transaction in comparison to a international banking transfer, there's no comparison. And then I guess the third element is obviously the nonprofit, which is where all of this sort of that's kind of the platform that we've used for the Ekasi project. And the nonprofit has been in existence since 2010. It's called the Surfer Kids. We started that at the same time as we started the surf tourism business. And I just looked at the situation, and I figured that I've got some skills that I can share with people, and I think those skills will have a positive impact on their life. And so let's get some kids down to the beach and teach them surfing. I know it's a positive thing. It was for me anyway. And the Surfer Kids kind of started growing, and then at some point in 2020, the nonprofit basically died. COVID took care of that, because we were very reliant on the tourism industry for donations. And as a last gasp of air, I looked at the nonprofit and I figured, well, perhaps we can turn this into something else, and perhaps we can use the nonprofit, or perhaps we can resuscitate the nonprofit by turning it into a replica of Bitcoin Beach. Because I've been following that story for quite some time by that stage too. And I knew that, well, what they were doing there, we could pretty much do the same thing. Obviously, adjusted for local circumstances. This is not El Salvador, but it's similar enough to copy paste and adjust. And that's basically what we did in 2021. Starting around, I think it was July or August 2021, we started doing that, and essentially just started with a very small bit of Bitcoin that we injected into the township economy by paying a small portion of one of the coaches' salaries in Bitcoin, and then onboarding at least one shop where and that shop is still on board, and where he started spending his salary. And as the saying goes, the rest is history. Everything just came from there.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I think that, yeah, obviously the inspiration from, what we've seen in El Salvador it's almost like a replica of that, yet I almost feel like El Salvador gets kind of like all the lights. I mean, I suppose because they have got, a president that's obviously invested from that side of it, so I totally get it. But I think we need to, bang the drum in terms of what it is that you guys are doing. Obviously, that's an important kind of like model to take out there. I want to just chat about kind of like the long-term vision of this thing. I mean, if you sit down now and you kind of like some kind of like going, the other way around, like look at the vision as opposed to, like the starting point of this thing. What do you want to get out of this thing when you think about kind of this obsession with Bitcoin and this journey that you've been on? What is the kind of like the vision that you see playing out, say, over the next 5-10 years on this project?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. But what I want ultimately is the separation of money and state. That's why that's what I'm in this for.
Yeah.
Obviously, with the project, I have more sort of localized goals. I want to. There's a couple of things. I mean, starting from the sort of micro level where you look at the project itself and just the people that are involved in that project, I would like to give people the tools combined with the skills to uplift themselves. I've known I mean, I'm a recovering addict, and so I understand that if the desire to change does not come from within, there's no way that a person is going to change. You can shout and scream at them, you can put them in jail, you can do whatever the hell you want. If they themselves don't decide to empower themselves, then that's so. So my aim on a sort of micro level in the local community in this project is to try and give people the inspiration and then obviously the tools, because even once a person has made that decision, you got to give them the tools to help them on that journey of self-empowerment, and Bitcoin is one of those tools. It's a very important part of that, because obviously that's how people build and accumulate capital for the future, for their family, for themselves, for their their neighbors, for their community, etc. If you go a little further out than that, then my aim is also to sort of in a kind of a approachable way challenge people's assumptions with this project, so that people, we had a local we had 2 classes from a local private school at the project yesterday, and the teachers were very curious. The principal of the school, this is a completely separate school that disconnected from the project, and they just came to visit because they're curious, and they look at what we're doing and they're like, oh wow, I didn't know this about Bitcoin. I didn't and so it kind of challenges people's assumptions. It prompts them to ask questions, and these are people from outside of the project. so that's another aim. But then ultimately, those are all kind of like subject to the overarching goal. And my ultimate personal goal, and it has been from the very beginning since I, became involved with Bitcoin, is, once you start going down the rabbit hole, you pretty quickly realize that ultimately what we have to do is the separation of money and state. It's an incredibly important thing to accomplish, because ultimately the fusion of money and state is what creates a hell of a lot of problems in the world. Chief among which I think is this tendency to get involved and continue forever wars, where money is just printed and thrown into conflict zones. And I don't think that's something that we should continue with. So yeah, separation of money state. Ultimately, that's that's what I'm here for, man.
Yeah, and what a better place to do it in kind of like the tapestry that is South Africa, where you've had all this kind of like the strife over the past. Obviously, a lot of people with a lot of disadvantages. Apartheid did us no favors, and I think if there was ever going to be kind of like a model for Bitcoin and doing that separation, I think this is probably the place to do it, in my mind anyways. And I think if we approach this thing not only from the grassroots, but I mean, obviously on all levels, I think it's going to make a huge difference. Let's go to the beginning of this thing, right? And kind of like tell us about the conversations that you had in the beginning, especially with, township environments, obviously probably a lot of skepticism, probably a lot more skepticism in that environment than you probably would have, if you walked into one of the local banks, I would imagine. Yeah, tell us about that.
I mean, I was quite surprised when we first started. Obviously, I mean, I come from a very, very different background compared to the people that we work with. I mean, I'm white, I'm Afrikaans. I grew up in a relatively privileged environment. I'm old enough to remember the ending of apartheid. My first couple of years in public school in South Africa, it was a whites only school, etc., etc. So I don't, I'm not from the township community. I mean, I spend more time there than 99% of white people ever will, but still, I'm not from there. So my assumptions were challenged when we started this project, because yes, I've gotten a lot of resistance from people talking about Bitcoin over the years. And when we started spreading this in the township, it's almost as if, I mean, first of all, yes, there was a lot of sort of pushback, because people instantly assumed it's a scam, because they've been scammed before. Like, look, scams are way more prevalent in areas where you've got challenges with literacy. If there's a higher tendency of people not knowing how to read and write, there's also a higher tendency for people to be exploited through financial scams. So we had to deal with that. But the interesting thing was that once you demonstrated the immediate utility of Bitcoin, people were far more ready to adopt it than what I had encountered before in my sort of familial and social surroundings, because generally people from a more privileged background do not have these immediate problems to solve. Whereas if you speak with people in the township, there's immediate problems that could be solved. And I mean, like a very stupid example. It's not a stupid. I mean, it's not stupid, but a very simple example. That's a better word. A very simple example is, you can install a custodial Lightning wallet. You can install Bitrefill, and you can send somebody sats, and they can purchase airtime for themselves, all within a space of 5 minutes. And if you don't have a bank account and you operate entirely on cash, that entire process has never been possible before. The only way to buy airtime would be to, take your paper notes, walk to a local spaza shop, hope that you don't get robbed on the way if it's late at night, and then buy your airtime that way. So obviously being able to do that entire process from your phone without having to leave your house, that's a major, that's a major change. That's a major problem solved for somebody who, and people from a more privileged background don't have that problem, because you've had internet banking your whole life. Buying airtime from your banking app is as easy as it is doing it through Bitrefill and a Lightning wallet. So nothing really changes. So things like that, that meant that in a way it was easier to have that conversation in the township. I mean, look, I wasn't the one having those conversations. I just have to clarify that. The team that I work with. Most of all, our community lead, Lutando, him and I started this project together because he was the only coach that was left when the Surfer Kids died in 2020. And so I had this conversation with him about, resuscitating the nonprofit by doing this. It was me and him who had this conversation together, and I was like, well, from my side, I'll give you the education and the background and the intro to Bitcoin, and I'll give you all the resources you need, but you have to go into the township and onboard the shops, and you have to be willing to take a part of your salary in Bitcoin. I mean, by that time, I'd been taking a massive part of my salary in Bitcoin because our business had been running on Bitcoin since, 2014. So I didn't have any qualms about proposing this to him because I knew it was, doable. But he had to take that leap of faith. Unfortunately, it did. So he was the one that was having these conversations with the shop owners in the beginning. And it went a lot faster in the beginning than I thought it would. I didn't think it would be so. I mean, I'm not saying it was easy to get the shops on board, but I didn't know whether we would get them on board or not. I figured there's a pretty decent chance of failure. Whereas, Lutando went out there, he had minimal knowledge of Bitcoin in the beginning, obviously, because, I had a month or two where I could sit and talk with him before we actually started going. And he got 2 or 3 shops on board within the first 3 months, and started spending Bitcoin at those shops, and those shops are still on board. And today we pay 100% of all salaries for the entire team. And I mean, we're talking about 11 people working full time and 5 people working part time, and nobody earns any of their salaries in fiat.
So, I mean, obvious question. How are you guys funding this thing at the moment? I mean, obviously 11 people, full-time, part-time.
Good question.
That's coin that's going out. So where's the money coming from?
A lot of the funding, especially initially, came from Bitcoin Beach. It sounds like a very radical expansion when you think about Lutando being the only employee left in 2020, and now, sort of 4 years later, we're at a team of all in all 16 people. But you've got to keep in mind, we're talking about township salaries, so we're not it's not quite as radical as it sounds, because we're trying to empower people who come from a background where they don't necessarily have the education or the skills. So we do a lot of education during the work process. But the funding in the beginning mostly came from Bitcoin Beach. We still get a lot of support from them. We have some corporate sponsors, people who want to see Bitcoin adoption. We recently constructed a skate park that was fully funded by Block, which is the umbrella company for all of Jack Dorsey's other companies. We've had support from the HRF, the Human Rights Foundation. They've got a financial freedom track. Alex Gladstein has been fantastic. He's the CSO, the Chief Strategy Officer for the HRF. They've been great in supporting people working to get Bitcoin adopted at a grassroots level. So it's the funding is coming from companies and organizations that want to see Bitcoin being adopted at a grassroots level. And I guess they understand that projects like this is a kind of an example or a inspiration or whatever you want to call it, or a template for other people to go out and copy. Because ultimately, if we're going to win this game, which is the separation of money and state, if we're going to win this game, Bitcoin has to be adopted from a grassroots level up. That's the only way this actually happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome to hear that you guys have still got those shops on board. I mean, I suppose the other question would be like, what keeps them motivated to continue obviously using this? Is it just about the fact that they obviously don't have to rely on that third party, namely a bank? Is it easier for them? Are they finding that that's kind of like that path to least is a path of least resistance? I mean, what is the kind of the feedback that you guys have received from, you know, the spaza owners and the shop owners?
Well, so I mean, I think one has to remember that banking is actually very convenient. Like it's great to be able to sit behind your computer and run a business without having to drive up and down, paying people with cash all the time. It's great to be able to pay a supplier who is maybe in the town next to yours, 100 kilometers away, and he sends his driver through with a truck, and the delivery happens, and you can do all of that from your office. You don't have to go about settling payments in cash. I mean, that's fantastically convenient. Um, a lot of people in the township don't have access to that. A lot of the spaza shops have access to it, but they prefer not to use it because of very high banking fees. So South Africa's banking fees are actually comparable to Germany. Just as an example, obviously we don't have the same level of income as people living in Germany. So that gives you an idea of the disparity and how much we're being nailed by the banks in terms of fees. And this discourages a lot of people in the township to use banks, which then has a knock-on effect in terms of security, because then you're sitting with large amounts of cash on your premises, and it's not uncommon for some of these spaza shops to get robbed quite often. So there's immediate benefits to be had in using Bitcoin, because the moment people understand is, like, when you first onboard a spaza shop, they kind of immediately realize that, well, this is like a bank account, but I don't have to pay for it. Like, the only transaction fees that I pay are fees that when I make an actual transaction, and those fees are super low if you're dealing with custodial Lightning, which is totally fine for smaller amounts. So it's quite convenient and very cheap, and it's also open. They don't have to go and stand in a queue with a pile of documents to do this, and they can switch to a different wallet if there's a new one that comes out with better features. They don't have to, go and stand in another queue with another pile of documents to switch from one to the other. So all of these things are immediate benefits, but then obviously the shops that have been onboarded for some time, the benefit that they see is a substantial increase in their savings, because the shops are the ones who took on most of the risk in the beginning, and the ones who stayed on board, which is most of them, have been accepting sats as payment throughout the entire bear market. And because our coaches represent a small percentage of their turnover, those shops don't have to cash out all the Bitcoin that they receive. They do use some of it, but they can afford to keep quite a bit of it. And they've seen Bitcoin's price double within the space of a year, and even more than double if some of the shops that have been on board for a little while longer. I mean, Bitcoin was down at about 300,000 Rand at some point. So it's almost triple that now. So, if you're a shop owner in the township and you've been accepting sats as payment for the last 2 years, and you've been keeping most of that, by now you're, fully convicted in terms of like what this thing is going to do for you. And we haven't even started yet, like in terms of where we're going. It's still early days.
So in terms of other parts of the country, I mean, obviously you guys have got a base where you're at the moment. I mean, so kind of like looking beyond kind of your area, right now? I mean, obviously, for me, it's like, why has this happened? Why has this not happened in Cape Town? You know, you've got a large amount of people here, perfect environment. You know, it's kind of like similar environment to what you guys have there, but it's kind of like 100x. What's happening in Cape Town? When can we see this kind of thing happening this side? Have you found any able and willing people to carry the baton this side?
So there's a couple of projects around the country that have um, been replicating what we do, but again, like we did with the Bitcoin Beach model, they are not doing exactly what we did. They've adjusted for local context, and again, with the help of Bitcoin Beach, we've been supporting um, some of those projects through a fund that was set up by Bitcoin Beach. Um, and this is coming from the original donor that got the Bitcoin Beach project off the ground, who's an anonymous person. Nobody knows who this person is, but they obviously want to see global adoption, and they're willing to put some of their Bitcoin into that effort. So in Cape Town, there's a project called Bitcoin Loxion. Loxion is another word for Ekasi, which also refers to a township. They are in Khayelitsha. I personally haven't been there, but Lutando has been down there with the Bitcoin Cruiser, the big orange Land Cruiser with the kudu horns on it. So he's been down there to visit them. They were at the conference we had earlier this year. They'll be at the conference again next year. And then there's Witstrand, which is about an hour and a half from Mossel Bay. Witstrand is very different in the sense that it's not based on a social project, but it comes down to the same thing. It's a very tight-knit community, very small community, and about half the businesses in Witstrand now accept Bitcoin. There's a couple of others that are sort of still in the sort of the idea phase. They haven't actually, so I can't really talk about them because they haven't been executed yet. But outside South Africa, in Southern Africa, there's one in Zambia, in Victoria Falls, called Bitcoin Vic Falls. They're in Livingston. And there's a project in Ghana that we've been supporting for almost 2 years, called Bitcoin Dua. So these things are kind of like popping up here and there. I mean, it's really difficult to get something like this off the ground. We were lucky that we had the combination of an existing social platform in the Surfer Kids, combined with the fact that the person running that project, which is myself, has an extensive background in Bitcoin itself. Because if you don't have either one of those two things, then it becomes quite difficult. It's really difficult to build a social initiative from scratch, but it's also really difficult to fast track your way into understanding Bitcoin and understanding why this is important and why it matters. There's no way to fast track either one of those, and so I don't think you'll see these popping up in every single town. But I've been quite surprised by how many there has been. I mean, there's another one that just recently started in Kenya, and ultimately they all have one thing in common with Bitcoin Beach, and that is that there's two sides to the equation. There's the side where you onboard shops to accept Bitcoin as payment, but that's the easy side of the equation. The more difficult side of the equation is the other side, which is how do you get people to spend it? Because that's what keeps the shops on board. And if you can solve those two sides of the equation, that's where the idea of a circular economy comes from, because then the sats start flowing. And if that happens at a grassroots level, ultimately, if we do succeed in the separation of money and state, what you're really talking about is you're talking about a global Bitcoin circular economy where the sats flow in a circular fashion, but it's just happening all around the world.
Yeah, I think what's interesting for me in this discussion, and obviously the circular economy, is that, we look at kind of like the original idea that Satoshi put forward, and that's obviously a peer-to-peer payment network. I mean, that's what it was in essence, and still is in light of what it is that you're discussing, and it's just an interesting an interesting one to consider, because right now the narrative or the idea behind Bitcoin is digital gold. How do you see both those ideas as being kind of like at the center of what it is that you guys are doing? I mean, is it a case of a combination of the two? It sounds like it's more a payment thing as opposed to digital gold. Does it become digital gold because store owners and individuals that are participating in this circular economy hold on to it as well? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
It's 100% a combination of the two. I think any good form of money has to fulfill both at the same time. You can't have, you can't. I don't think you can have a good form of money if it's not both a solid store of value and at the same time a great medium of exchange. It's got to be both at the same time, and that's the challenge, or that's part of the challenge. And a lot of people in the Western world have been hanging on to this idea of Bitcoin as digital gold, and that's fine. I mean, look, Bitcoin changed my life because I used it as a store of value. Um, but it also changed my life because I used it as a medium of exchange, and it had significant impacts on my personal life because I adopted it as both. Um, in my case, and in the case of the coaches who we employ, it is adopted as a medium of exchange first. Um, in my case, it was for different reasons. In the case of the coaches that we employ in the project, and a lot of the people that are exposed to Bitcoin in the township, the reason it works to adopt it as a medium of exchange first is because that's how they learn about it. Especially if you're dealing with really young kids, or if you're dealing with people who don't read and write. Um, you know, the best way to educate a person about this thing is to demonstrate. And the best way to demonstrate is to show that, hey, you can actually buy stuff with this. Um, and that builds trust. And so when we first started paying Lutando's salary in Bitcoin back in August 2021, he was spending most of it. Slowly but surely, he started transitioning from, hey, I think I'm going to hold on to some of this stuff, and that's the same is true for the shops that we onboard. When we first onboard the shops, they'll cash out most of it, or they'll spend most of it buying stock for their shops or whatever. But eventually they start holding on to it, and they see the positive benefits of that. And it's to use a stupid pun, it's two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And I think even the people who, I mean, look, if you take the most hardcore digital gold advocate, Michael Saylor or someone like that, never sell your Bitcoin. It's like, well, dude, eventually you're gonna have to use it. Like, if this thing is not useful in some way to transfer the value that you have been holding on to for all these years, let's say you hold on to your stack for the next 50 years, if you don't see that it's useful at some point to deploy in some way, which by definition will involve moving it, then why is it valuable to begin with? Like, it is the fact that you can very easily move it around the world. And it's a little disingenuous when people say, oh, but it's difficult to move Bitcoin and it's slow and it's expensive. It's like, well, it's 100x improvement on international bank transfers. I mean, even today, even if I don't use Lightning, even if I go on chain, disregard all the second layer implementations that are out there. Even if I go old school on chain, it's still way better than international bank transfers. So it is a great medium of exchange if you think about it that way, and particularly if you're talking about the custodial Lightning solutions that we use. Sending money anywhere in the world. Well, we had a little fundraiser recently for a shop that burned down in the township, and people were sending $1 or $2 from the furthest corners of the planet. I mean, how are you going to replicate that? It's a great medium of exchange and a great store of value. And I think a lot of the people that are holding on, and this is actually a bit of a debate that we have in the Bitcoin community, is I often sort of have this debate with people that are, fiercely hanging on to this store of value digital gold only narrative, because I'm like, well, I don't see it that way, and my experience is very different. I've literally been using it as a medium of exchange since 2014, and I mean that was before Lightning was even proposed. So my experience shows otherwise, and I see value in that. And I don't discount the digital gold narrative. I just think that you gotta look at both of those narratives at the same time. Otherwise we're going nowhere.
I completely agree with you. I think it's got to be a combination of both. The value needs to be transferred in some form or another, and I think if you have that, like you said, the circular economy, I think that's the whole point of it. We obviously agree on this. So unfortunately, we can't argue this point with one another. So let's just leave it at that. I, I think for me, like one of the coolest things about the story is that it's not just conversations, because I find that, especially in being very much a part of a wider crypto community, not only Bitcoin but just across the board, I think there's a lot of over intellectualization, and there's obviously like this experiment is very important to a lot of people, but I think too many conversations get had as opposed to just getting down and doing it. And for me, that was the main reason why I wanted to get you on today, was to kind of like prove that we can have the discussions, we can theorize, and we can get into the fundamentals of Bitcoin from a theoretical basis. But here we have a working example that actually is kind of like benefiting those in many ways that really need it. Like someone who's living in Hollywood and drives a Porsche and the rest of it, you could argue they don't really need Bitcoin. Like they don't really, even though they do, but they don't really. You'll never convince them. Whereas when you look at people in the ghetto who really do need that extra $1 or $2 a month that they're saving on bank charges, it does make a difference. And you guys have obviously made that happen. And yeah, well done. I take my hat off to you. Well done, sir. And yeah, long may it continue. And yeah, I really appreciate your time. Like yeah, you won't like yeah, don't ever stop, eh? Don't ever stop doing what you guys are doing. Yeah, if you need anything in Cape Town, let me know. And yeah, well done, man. It's truly an inspiration, not only for the people that need it the most, but also for those of us who like to over intellectualize stuff. So yeah, well played.
Yeah, cool, man. I really appreciate that. I fully agree with that point. I think at some point, you gotta get out there and get your hands dirty. If this thing is gonna do what we hope it does. It's gotta stop having intellectual conversations at some point. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, obviously that's the sort of the fundamental layer. But we can't expect everybody in the world to understand this thing before it becomes adopted. It's about going out there and literally, getting your boots in the mud. Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, I think the people in Hollywood, or Constantia for that matter, they don't yet need Bitcoin. The difference between them and the environment that we're in is the people that we're working with need Bitcoin right now. The people in Constantia, the people in Hollywood or wherever else, they're going to need it, but the problem is in the future. The problem is further down the line. And ironically, I think the majority of more privileged people will be the last ones to adopt it, because they'll be the last ones to actually feel this on their skin. which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because in a way it does kind of, obviously there are very wealthy people in the first world that have adopted Bitcoin, but I think en masse, it's kind of like a how can I put it, a middle out adoption model, where you probably won't see a lot of adoption in the kind of environments that we're in the townships. But I think where you'll see the vast majority of adoption is people in the middle class, people who are going to start feeling the heat, and who are already feeling the heat, but also have the educational background to understand what they're getting themselves into. And that can kind of flip the narrative and transfer a lot of, not transfer wealth, but create a lot of new wealth where before there wasn't that. And I think it's quite interesting to think about that flippening, you know. I mean, imagine Bitcoin does what we expect it's going to do in the next 20 years. You know, there's people in this little township who live in shacks that have accumulated more Bitcoin than what the average person in Constantia will ever get their hands on, once it becomes, you know, truly widespread. You know, there's only so much Bitcoin in the world. That's the beauty of it. And I'm really curious and excited to see what happens in this township and in many other places around the world, where the sort of lower middle class are the people who adopt it first, long before the wealthy masses, if you can call it that, get into it, because they don't have a reason to do so.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. You, sir, are a fantastic ambassador for Bitcoin, but more importantly, a fantastic ambassador for empowering people. And thanks for joining us. To anyone who's listening or watching, go check out Bitcoin Ekasi, go see what they're doing. I mean, like Herman was saying earlier on, they just finished building a bowl for the skateboarders. They've got a surf school. They've got coaches. They've got community involvement. Like I said at the beginning of the pod, this is a feel-good story that really needs support, not just with money, but just go out there and spread the news and let people know that you know there are people making a difference in the name of Bitcoin community. And awesome. Thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe. We do appreciate it. And see you on the next episode of Blockmates Orange. Take it easy.
All right, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a like, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on for next time. See ya.